I met my boyfriend James last year in college. We were both fresh to the campus scene, still figuring out our paths, but we clicked almost immediately. It wasn't like a whirlwind romance you see in movies. Our relationship started slow, built on casual hangouts, late-night conversations, and shared interests. We became inseparable, gradually crossing that line between close friends and something more. James is 18, and I'm 19, so we're still navigating a lot of firsts in life, let alone in relationships. But one thing I've always appreciated is how comfortable we are around each other. He's affectionate, sweet, and has this way of making me feel like the most important person in the world. Over the months, we've grown closer, learning about each other's quirks, boundaries, and preferences. One thing became clear early on. James is obsessed with my legs. He says they're his favorite feature of mine, constantly showering them with attention, whether it's a quick squeeze, playful kisses, or admiring comments. At first, it felt flattering, like an endearing quirk. I didn't mind it. In fact, I liked the attention. But as our physical relationship deepened, his affection for my legs began to shift into something more intense, even fixated. It wasn't just my legs, though. James's attention naturally gravitated to my butt as well. He'd playfully grab or pat it when we cuddled, always keeping things lighthearted. But as his affections grew bolder, I noticed a pattern. His playful nibbles on my legs were becoming regular bites. And with each one, I felt less playful and more uncomfortable. I'm sensitive to touch, especially in those areas, and even the lightest brush can make me squirm. I began to wonder if this difference between us might eventually cause tension. From a young age, I've been physically sensitive. It's not something I advertise, but it's a reality that affects me more than people realize. A simple pat on the back can feel overwhelming, and a firm squeeze might linger on my skin for minutes. This sensitivity extends especially to my lower body, my legs and butt. Even a soft touch in those areas can send shivers through me, a mix of sensation and overstimulation that's hard to explain. When James and I became more physical, this sensitivity quickly became apparent. The first time he kissed the back of my thighs, I jolted in surprise. He laughed it off, thinking it was cute, and I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't entirely pleasant. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy his attention. It was just that his enthusiasm and my sensitivity weren't always compatible. James's playful affection started with kisses, but soon enough, it escalated to nibbles. He'd laugh, calling them love bites. But to me, they felt more like tiny jolts of pain. I tried to adjust, figuring it was just part of the way he showed affection. I didn't want to ruin the moment, and honestly, I liked the attention, up to a point. But the line became clearer one day when he bit the back of my leg a little too hard. I winced, pulling away instinctively. He immediately apologized, brushing it off as playful, but I couldn't help noticing how unbalanced our preferences were. For him, it seemed like harmless fun, but for me, it felt invasive, even overwhelming. I began to voice my discomfort more clearly after that. "Can you go easy on the biting?" I'd ask, trying to keep the tone light. He'd usually agree, but his enthusiasm never really waned. Over time, I noticed that what started as playful gestures were becoming points of tension. It was hard not to feel like I was overreacting, but at the same time, I knew my feelings were valid. The question was, how could I communicate them without making him feel rejected? James has always been unapologetically expressive about the things he loves, and apparently, my legs and butt topped that list. He'd joke about it often, making exaggerated comments like, "They're the eighth wonder of the world," or, "How did I get so lucky?" It was flattering, and honestly, his humor made it easy to laugh along. But beneath the jokes, his fascination was more intense than I initially realized. Over time, I started noticing just how much of his affection revolved around those areas. Whether we were cuddling, watching a movie, or even just sitting together, his hands and lips always gravitated to my legs or my butt. It wasn't just casual touches anymore. It felt deliberate, like a need he couldn't quite resist. He'd often bring up the idea of biting during our playful moments. "You know, a little nibble never hurt anyone," he'd tease, flashing that grin that made it hard to say no. I'd laugh it off at first, but when I gently reminded him that I wasn't comfortable with it, he'd act surprised, as though it wasn't a big deal. "Come on, it's normal. Couples do this kind of stuff all the time," he'd insist, as if convincing me would change how it felt. The more he talked about it, the more I wondered if I was being unreasonable. Was I overthinking something that other people found perfectly fine? James clearly wasn't trying to hurt me. He genuinely thought it was harmless, even fun. And while part of me wanted to explore that with him, the thought of enduring even the smallest bite made me flinch. I started feeling the weight of his expectations, even though he wasn't forcing anything. It became a silent tug-of-war between his desires and my boundaries, one I wasn't sure how to navigate without disappointing him. As James's fascination with biting grew more evident, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to approach the issue with compromise in mind, hoping we could find a middle ground that would work for both of us. One night, after a particularly intense nibble on my thigh left me wincing, I gently brought it up. "Hey, I know you really like this, but it's kind of too much for me sometimes," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, his expression somewhere between surprise and concern. "Too much? But I don't mean to hurt you," he replied earnestly, his fingers tracing small circles on my leg. "It's just something I really enjoy. Can we try easing into it?" His request was sincere, and I didn't want to shut him down completely. After all, relationships are about give and take, right? So I agreed to small changes. We decided he'd keep things light, kisses and soft touches, and avoid anything more unless I explicitly gave the green light. For a while, it seemed to work. He respected the boundary, keeping his playfulness in check. But as time went on, his restraint started slipping. He'd sneak in little nibbles when he thought I wouldn't mind, always brushing them off with a laugh. "It's just a tiny bite," he'd say, grinning as if it was no big deal. And while I wanted to believe it wasn't, my body's reaction told me otherwise. There were moments when I wondered if I was being overly sensitive. He never meant to hurt me, that much was clear. But even with the compromises, I couldn't shake the discomfort. Every time he pushed the boundary, even slightly, it felt like a breach of trust. I kept telling myself that relationships required patience and understanding. But deep down, I was starting to feel like I was the one doing all the compromising, while James's wants stayed firmly at the center. It was a quiet evening at my apartment. We had planned a relaxed night in, pizza, a dumb comedy, and lots of cuddling. I had almost forgotten about the ongoing tension over the biting, especially since James had been sticking to our agreed limits recently. I felt comfortable, like we had finally settled into a rhythm that worked for both of us. As the movie played, James's hands wandered, as they often did, to my legs. I didn't mind. It was familiar, comforting even. But then, without warning, he leaned down and bit the back of my thigh. Not softly, not playfully, but with a pressure that made me gasp in pain. I immediately jerked away, clutching my leg. "James, what the hell?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze, looking genuinely startled by my reaction. "I thought we were past this," he said, his tone defensive. "It's not like I meant to hurt you. I just got carried away." "That's the problem," I shot back, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You're not listening to me. I've told you over and over that this hurts, and you keep doing it anyway. Why can't you just stop?" The room fell silent except for the faint background noise of the movie. James looked down at his hands, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, more unsure. I don't see why it's such a big deal," he muttered. "It's something normal couples do. I thought if you tried it a few times, you'd get used to it." Hearing that stung more than I expected. I wasn't sure if it was the implication that I was abnormal for not liking it, or the realization that he still didn't fully understand where I was coming from. "I'm not going to get used to being hurt, James," I said firmly. "This isn't about being normal or not. It's about respect." He didn't respond, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. I wanted to believe he meant well, that he wasn't trying to push my boundaries intentionally. But in that moment, it felt like he valued his desires more than my comfort. After that night, I couldn't stop replaying the incident in my head. James's words, his tone, the look on his face. They all lingered, gnawing at me. I didn't doubt that he cared about me, but his inability to understand my perspective left me questioning more than just the moment. Was I being too rigid? Was this really such a minor thing that I was blowing out of proportion? I tried to look at it from his side. He saw biting as an expression of affection, something playful and intimate. To him, it wasn't supposed to be painful, and maybe he genuinely believed that I could learn to enjoy it over time. I could understand that logic, but I couldn't make my body agree with it. The sharp sting of his teeth wasn't something I could overlook, no matter how much I cared for him. Still, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe I was the problem. Relationships are supposed to be about compromise, aren't they? Maybe I was shutting down something that was important to him just because it didn't align with my comfort zone. But then again, wasn't it my right to set boundaries for my own body? I started to feel trapped between two conflicting ideas: the need to respect my own limits and the fear of being a bad partner. Was I being selfish? Or was I just standing up for myself? The lines felt blurry, and I wasn't sure how to navigate them. James and I didn't talk much in the days that followed. The air between us was heavy, and though we tried to act normal, the unspoken tension hung over every interaction. I could feel the weight of his disappointment, and it only made me doubt myself more. A few days later, I decided I couldn't let the silence between us stretch any longer. The tension was unbearable, and I knew we had to address what had happened. I invited James over, determined to have an honest, open conversation about everything. We sat on my couch, an awkward gap between us that felt bigger than it should. I took a deep breath and started, my voice steady, but soft. "James, I need to talk about the other night. I don't want us to keep avoiding this." He nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too," he admitted. "I don't want us to fight over something like this." That was a relief, at least. I explained my feelings as clearly as I could, hoping he'd finally understand. "It's not that I don't appreciate your affection. I do. I love that you're so open about how you feel about me. But the biting, it's not the same for me as it is for you. It hurts, and it makes me uncomfortable. It's not about me trying to control you. It's about me setting a boundary for something that affects my body." He listened, though his face betrayed a mix of emotions: confusion, frustration, and something that looked like guilt. "I get what you're saying," he said finally, his tone measured. "But it's hard for me to understand why it's such a big deal. I mean, I'd never want to hurt you, but this feels so small, you know?" I nodded, trying to meet him halfway. "I get that it feels small to you, but for me, it's not. It's not just about the physical discomfort. It's about feeling like my voice matters. Like you're willing to prioritize my comfort, even if it's over something you enjoy." There was a long pause. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to make you feel like I don't respect you. I just didn't realize how much this was affecting you." In that moment, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and it gave me hope that we could move forward. In the days following our conversation, there was a noticeable shift in James. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he truly understand my perspective, or would the tension between us linger? To my relief, he seemed to take what I'd said to heart, though not without some lingering frustration. He made an effort to show restraint during our intimate moments. The playful nibbles and bites that had become a regular feature of our time together were noticeably absent. Instead, He focused on other ways to express affection: soft kisses, gentle touches, and words of affirmation. It felt like he was trying to meet me halfway, and I appreciated the effort. But even as things improved on the surface, I could sense an undercurrent of disappointment in him. He didn't say it outright, but his body language spoke volumes. When he'd stop himself from going further, there was a hesitation, a slight pullback, as if he were holding something in. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that adjustments take time and that we were both doing our best to adapt. One evening, while we were lying on the couch, he finally addressed it. "You know," he started, his voice careful, "I've been trying to respect what you said. And I really don't want you to think I'm upset or anything, but it's hard for me to completely let go of this." I turned to face him, caught off guard by his honesty. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "It's just, I guess it's a part of how I connect, physically," he said, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Not being able to do it feels like I'm holding back, and I don't want that to create distance between us." His words hit me harder than I expected. I could see how much he was struggling to reconcile his desires with my boundaries. And while I appreciated his willingness to try, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his unspoken wish. It wasn't a demand, but it lingered in the space between us, leaving me unsure of how to bridge the gap without compromising myself. After James's admission, I found myself trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and overthinking. His words weren't meant to guilt me, but they lingered in my mind like an unanswered question. Was I being unreasonable? Relationships require compromise, and here he was, trying to adjust for me. Shouldn't I be doing the same for him? I began replaying our moments together, dissecting every instance where I'd drawn a line. Was I being too rigid, too quick to shut him down? Or was I justified in sticking to my boundaries? It felt like a tug of war between being a good partner and protecting my comfort. The balance seemed impossible to strike. I started questioning the very idea of boundaries. Were they supposed to be immovable, or did love and compromise blur the lines? I hated the thought of disappointing James. He wasn't asking for something outrageous, just a small gesture that, to him, symbolized intimacy and connection. But to me, it wasn't small. It was a visceral discomfort that I couldn't simply will away. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't just about biting. It was about respect, about feeling heard and valued. James wasn't malicious, and I knew he cared for me deeply. But the fact that we kept circling back to this same issue made me wonder if our perspectives on boundaries and compromise were fundamentally different. I wasn't angry at him, nor did I think he was wrong for wanting what he wanted. But I also couldn't ignore the growing feeling that my voice was getting lost in the shuffle. I wanted to be the kind of partner who could give as much as I received, but I wasn't sure where the line was between giving and losing myself. As I sat with everything, James's feelings, my own reflections, and the weight of our conversations, I realized I was no closer to an answer than when this all started. The tension between us had softened somewhat, but the issue still felt unresolved. It wasn't just about whether James could bite me or not. It was about whether I was handling this situation the right way. On one hand, I believed in boundaries. They were supposed to protect my comfort and autonomy, and I'd always thought that any healthy relationship should respect them. But on the other hand, compromise felt just as vital. I didn't want to become so rigid that I shut out James's needs entirely. If I couldn't bend here, did that make me selfish? Was I letting my sensitivity define too much of our relationship? I thought about all the advice I'd heard about love being a balance. Was this an area where I was tipping the scale too far toward myself? Or was James the one leaning too heavily on his wants without fully grasping my discomfort? The lines blurred every time I thought I had a clear answer. Eventually, I decided to bring the question out into the open. I told James exactly how I felt, not just about the biting, but about the deeper concerns it raised for me. "I need to know something," I said, looking him in the eyes. Am I being unfair by holding this boundary? Or is this just a matter of us needing to meet in the middle differently? James didn't answer right away, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. It felt like something I needed to ask, not just him, but myself, and maybe even others. So now I'm asking you, am I the bad guy here? Am I wrong for sticking to my boundaries, even if it makes my partner feel like something's missing? Or should I be pushing myself further to meet him halfway? I'm genuinely torn, and I don't know if there's a right answer. What do you think?